The moment she couldn't keep quiet any longer, her father-in-law walked up and said to her face, "You ruined my family, you don't deserve to be with us." Her husband stood by her side and said nothing. That was the moment she realized that she would forever be a stranger to his parents. Chapter 1: The First Blow. Sarah had always imagined motherhood would be different. She had thought it would be filled with laughter and soft moments, gentle cuddles and sweet lullabies. But as she stared down at the crib where her baby boy, Liam, lay wide-eyed and restless, she felt the weight of her reality pressing against her chest. The house was silent except for the soft sound of Liam's soft whimpers, and it seemed as if time had come to a standstill. She should have been content, proud even. Instead, she felt an overwhelming sense of isolation. It started in the hospital. Her mother-in-law, Carol, had hovered over her from the moment she arrived, her smile too wide, her eyes too eager, as if she were trying to prove something. Sarah had given birth to Liam after a long, painful labor, and though the moment should have been full of warmth, she couldn't shake the feeling that Carol was there to assess her, to see if she was good enough. It didn't stop after the baby was born. Carol had a way of inserting herself into every decision Sarah made, as if she were the one who had given birth. Every choice Sarah made about feeding, sleeping arrangements, even the brand of diapers, Carol had a suggestion, a better suggestion. And when Sarah hesitated or questioned her, she would give a soft, almost condescending smile, as if to say, "Asterisk, I've done this before. You're just learning, asterisk." But it wasn't just Carol. Peter, her husband, had become distant. He had always been a loving man, kind and patient, but the changes in their home were becoming too much to bear. He wasn't the same anymore. After a long day at work, Sarah expected to see him hold Liam, to feel that connection between them, but instead, he seemed more interested in the television or his phone. He had started coming home later, his excuses growing more vague. One evening, she stood in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she heard the familiar sound of Carol's voice through the door. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. It was sharp, almost like a reprimand. Sarah's stomach churned as the conversation grew louder. She knew exactly what was happening. Carol was telling Peter that Sarah wasn't doing things the right way with Liam. She wasn't giving him enough attention. She wasn't following the right feeding schedule. And God forbid, she let Liam sleep in the crib with a blanket that wasn't perfectly folded. Her hands shook as she set the knife down. The smell of the dinner she was cooking filled the air, but it was suddenly suffocating. She could feel the pressure building inside her chest, the tightness in her throat. She had never been good at confrontation, but she had reached a breaking point. "This is my baby too," she thought, her mind racing. Why does she think she knows everything? The conversation grew louder, and Sarah finally couldn't stand it any longer. She stormed out of the kitchen and into the living room. Carol was sitting on the couch, looking as though she had every right to be there. Her arms crossed tightly as Peter stood by the door, looking uncomfortable. "Why don't you let me handle things? Sarah, you're a first-time mom. It's a lot for you," Carol said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. Sarah's heart pounded as she turned to her husband. "Peter, why is she still here? Why does she think it's okay to tell me how to raise my son? We talked about this." Her voice cracked, though she hadn't meant it to. Peter's eyes widened, but he didn't speak. He shifted uncomfortably, not making eye contact with Sarah. Carol, on the other hand, didn't flinch. "Sarah, sweetie," Carol said, her voice taking on that tone Sarah despised. "It's not personal. I'm just trying to help. I know what's best for him. After all, I raised Peter. And look how well he turned out." The sting of that sentence hit Sarah like a slap in the face. She could feel the tears threatening to rise, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of Carol. Not in front of Peter. "That's the problem, Carol," Sarah said, her voice cold. "You never let me figure it out. I'm his mother. You're not." She could see the flicker of surprise in Carol's eyes, but before Carol could respond, Sarah turned to Peter, her voice now shaking with anger. "Peter, you need to choose. Your mother or me." The silence that followed was deafening. Peter opened his mouth, but no words came out. Carol sat back, arms crossed, and gave him a hard look. The tension in the room was palpable. It was a moment Sarah had been dreading, and now it was here. Peter stepped forward slowly, his eyes still not meeting hers. He walked past her and toward Carol, sitting down beside her, as if Sarah wasn't even in the room. For a moment, Sarah felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. The man she had loved, the father of her child, was choosing his mother over her. And it wasn't the first time. A cold laugh bubbled in Sarah's throat. She had never felt more alone in her life. And as Peter sat beside his mother, Sarah looked at him for the first time and wondered if he would ever look at her the same way again. In that silence, a new battle was born, and Sarah realized with a sinking feeling that nothing would ever be the same again. Chapter 2, Fractures. The next few days felt like a blur. Sarah tried to throw herself into motherhood, her routine becoming a way to block out the simmering tension in the house. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on Liam, there was an invisible wall growing between her and Peter, one that was impossible to ignore. Peter's silence was like a cold, suffocating fog. He no longer came home to hold Liam or share in the simple joys of parenting. His presence was hollow, his gaze always somewhere else, as if he were trying to avoid the reality of what had just unfolded. Sarah tried to hold it together for Liam. She did her best to keep the routine normal, to make him feel loved, even though the house had turned into a battleground. But when Peter wasn't there, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the silence, and the unspoken words lingered between them like a thick fog. One evening, as she was rocking Liam to sleep in the nursery, she heard the front door creak open. She knew it was Peter. He had been out again, coming home late like usual. She had stopped asking where he'd been. The distance between them had grown too wide, too painful to bridge with questions. When he entered the room, his eyes met hers briefly, but he said nothing. Sarah swallowed hard, clutching Liam's tiny hand as if it would give her the strength she desperately needed. "Peter," she began, her voice trembling but firm, "we need to talk. This has to stop." He sighed, the sound carrying an air of resignation. He leaned against the doorframe, looking down at the floor as if the weight of her words was too much to bear. "You're right, Sarah," he said quietly, avoiding her gaze. "We do need to talk, but I don't know where to start. I don't know how to fix this." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. His words were almost a relief, but they felt like a trap. She was standing on the edge of something deep and dark, and every part of her screamed to take a step back. But she couldn't. Not now. "Then let's start with this," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Why is your mother more important than me? More important than us? She doesn't get to dictate how I raise our son. You should be on my side. We should be on the same side, Peter." Peter closed his eyes, rubbing the back of his neck in a way that made him seem smaller, more defeated. "It's not that simple. You don't understand how things work with my family. My mom, she just has a way of making me feel like I'm not enough, like nothing I do is ever right. I don't want to disappoint her." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath catching in her throat. She had always known his family held sway over him, but hearing him say it out loud cut her deeper than she expected. "You're not disappointing her, Peter," Sarah whispered, taking a step forward. "You're disappointing me. We've built this life together, and I need you. I need you to stand by me. If you can't do that, I don't know what's left for us." The words hung in the air, thick with a tension that felt impossible to break. Peter remained silent, his face hidden in shadows. And then, in the most unexpected moment, the silence was shattered by a knock at the door. Sarah's heart skipped. Peter's face hardened, and he stiffened at the sound. "Who's that?" she asked, a sudden sense of dread creeping over her. Peter didn't answer. Instead, he stood there for a moment before walking toward the door. Sarah felt a cold rush of panic. When the door opened, Sarah's worst fear was realized. Carol was standing there, her face tight with that same unsettling smile Sarah had grown to resent. Behind her, Greg, Peter's father, whose presence had always been heavy and commanding, loomed in the background. His eyes were hard, cold, and unwelcoming. "Peter, we need to talk," Carol said, her voice crisp and filled with authority. Sarah could feel the blood drain from her face. "Mom, not now," Peter said, though his voice lacked conviction. He didn't shut the door, didn't send them away. His hands trembled as he held the doorframe, as though he was caught in a tug-of-war between his loyalty to his mother and his wife. Carol's eyes flicked to Sarah, her gaze sharp. "Oh, I think now's the perfect time, don't you? It's clear you and Sarah have some unresolved issues, and I'm here to help fix it. We're family, after all." Sarah's stomach turned. "No," she said, her voice steady but full of quiet fury. "You don't get to fix anything. Not anymore. You're not welcome here, Carol." Carol's expression hardened. "I think you're mistaken, Sarah. I am the family, and I will always be here. You're the one who's in the way." Greg stepped forward, his deep voice cutting through the tension. "You've been too lenient with her, Peter. Letting her run this household, letting her make decisions that affect all of us, has gone on long enough. You need to step up." Sarah felt her breath catch. This was not just a confrontation. It was a declaration, and the stakes were higher than she had ever anticipated. Peter looked at his father, then at Sarah, and for a brief moment, she saw something in his eyes. It wasn't love. It wasn't support. It was fear. Fear of losing everything. Peter turned back to his family, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to do anymore." And with that, Sarah understood. She had never been more alone. Chapter 3, The Breaking Point. The following days were filled with tension so thick it was suffocating. Sarah didn't know what was worse, the haunting silence between her and Peter, or the looming presence of Carol and Greg in their lives, always just a phone call away. Every time the phone rang, Sarah felt a jolt of dread. She could hear their voices before Peter even picked it up. The subtle way Carol used her manipulative words to make him feel small, to make him question his own decisions. And every time Peter came home, the walls between them seemed to grow higher, thicker. Peter's avoidance of her became more apparent. He no longer stayed for dinner, claiming work, or worse, staying at his parents' house, telling Sarah that things needed to be worked out before he could come home. Sarah found herself standing in their empty bedroom, Liam asleep in the crib, staring at the bed that felt so cold, so foreign now. The love she had once felt for Peter seemed to be slipping through her fingers, evaporating into the shadows of a home that no longer felt like hers. One night, as Sarah rocked Liam back to sleep, her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of Peter's car pulling into the driveway. She hadn't expected him, not tonight. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't know what to expect. Would he come in, offer a tired smile, and apologize for the distance? Would he stand at the door like he had done so many times, too afraid to confront her, too afraid to fight for their marriage? The door creaked open, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. Peter stood there, looking every bit the man who was torn between two worlds. His face was weary, his eyes dark with unspoken words. But this time, there was something different, something broken in the way he looked at her. "Sarah," he whispered, voice barely audible, "can we talk?" She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the blanket Liam lay under. She didn't want to talk. Not like this. Not with him standing there, as if everything were still the same, as if nothing had happened. But she had no choice. "Come in," she said, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions threatening to overtake her. She wasn't going to let him off the hook again. Not this time. Peter closed the door behind him, his footsteps soft but heavy as he approached the chair where she sat. His eyes flicked to Liam for a moment, and Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he saw the same love for their son that she saw every time she looked at him. "I don't know where to begin," Peter said, his voice trembling slightly. "I've been thinking about everything that's happened, and You need to make a choice, Peter," Sarah interrupted, her voice sharper than she intended. "You need to choose between me or them. I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending that nothing's wrong." Peter flinched at her words, as if they struck him like a blow. He stood there for a long moment, his eyes locked on the floor, before finally meeting her gaze. There was something in his eyes, something she hadn't seen before. A mix of shame, guilt, and a deep, unsettling fear. "I'm scared," he said softly, his voice breaking. "I'm scared of losing my family, Sarah. My parents, they've always been there for me. And I don't know if I can stand up to them. They've made me feel like I owe them, like I have to keep them happy." Sarah's heart clenched. She had known this was coming, but hearing him say it out loud hurt more than she had imagined. She had always known how much his parents controlled his life, how their influence ran deep, but she had hoped, believed, that love would be enough to break the cycle. "I get it, Peter," Sarah said, her voice softer now. "I get that you're caught in the middle, but you have a choice to make. You can either stand by me and our son, or you can let them tear us apart." Peter took a step back, running a hand through his hair. His frustration was palpable, but so was the weight of his indecision. Sarah felt her chest tighten. The silence between them stretched out for what felt like hours, and in that silence, she heard the distant echo of the life they had once shared. "I don't know what to do," Peter whispered, almost to himself. The vulnerability in his voice shattered something inside Sarah. She could feel the walls closing in again, the realization that no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she loved him, Peter was still a man who couldn't break free from the grip of his parents. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. The sound pierced the tension like a knife. "I'll get it," Peter said, his voice distant as he walked toward the door, his back turned to Sarah. Sarah sat there, frozen. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind, none of them good. She knew who it was. The knock was too familiar. She didn't need to hear it to know that Carol and Greg were on the other side, ready to lay claim to their son, their influence seeping into every crevice of their lives. Peter opened the door, and Sarah stood, the urge to confront them overwhelming her. But before she could take a step, she heard Carol's voice, sharp, commanding, the tone that always made Sarah's skin crawl. "We need to talk, Peter," Carol said, her voice cool and unwavering. Sarah's heart raced. She could feel the heat rise in her chest, the anger burning through her veins. "No, you don't," Sarah spat, her voice filled with the raw pain of too many broken promises. "You need to leave." There was a pause, an uncomfortable silence, before Carol's voice came back, softer but no less forceful. "You've made your choice, Peter," Carol said. "But remember, we are family. You can't just walk away from us." Sarah's blood ran cold. This was it. This was the breaking point. As Peter stood there, frozen, Sarah realized something she hadn't wanted to face. This wasn't just about her and Peter. This was about a battle for control over their lives. A battle that was being fought on every front, and she was losing. And in that moment, as she stood in the silence of her own home, Sarah understood that the fight wasn't just for her marriage. It was for her sanity, for her future, and for the future of her son. And she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep fighting alone. Chapter 4, The Crossroads. The days following that night felt like they were painted in shades of gray. Sarah's sense of time was warped. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion, yet the world outside seemed to keep turning without pause. Peter had gone quiet after Carol's visit, retreating deeper into himself, and Sarah found herself standing at a precipice, staring down at the life they had built together, wondering if there was anything left to salvage. Peter's absence was starting to feel permanent, like he was already lost to her. He wasn't staying at his parents' house every night, but he wasn't coming home either. His excuses had become more frequent, and his visits less so. Sarah tried to reach out, tried to bridge the gap, but every time she approached him with an open heart, all she encountered was a wall of indifference. The tension in the house grew unbearable. Liam seemed to sense it, his cries at night longer, louder, as if he too could feel the shifting currents of his parents' fractured world. Sarah did her best to soothe him, to reassure herself that she wasn't failing him. But as she stared into his innocent eyes, she couldn't help but wonder if she was already losing everything she had ever known. One evening, Sarah stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, her mind racing with thoughts of what had become of her marriage. Her hands moved automatically, the rhythmic sound of the knife against the cutting board oddly soothing, but every motion was accompanied by a knot in her stomach. She had never felt more alone in her life, The doorbell rang, pulling her from her thoughts. For a moment, she considered ignoring it. But the quiet knock grew louder, insistent. She placed the knife down carefully, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to answer the door, her heart thudding in her chest. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. Standing there, framed by the dim evening light, was Peter, looking as lost as she had ever seen him. His face was drawn, his shoulders heavy with the weight of something unspoken. But there was something in his eyes that made Sarah's heart race. A look of desperation. A look that told her he had made a decision, but hadn't yet found the words to express it. "Sarah," Peter said, his voice raw. "We need to talk. Please." She didn't say anything at first. She simply stepped aside to let him in, her mind spinning with all the questions she couldn't ask him. As he walked into the living room, Sarah's gaze fell to Liam, who was in his crib, peacefully asleep for the moment. She wondered if her son knew more about the fractures in their world than she was willing to admit. Peter sat on the edge of the couch, looking uncertain, his eyes darting around the room. The silence between them felt heavy, like it could break them both apart if it lingered for too long. "Peter," Sarah finally said, her voice tight with emotion, "what are we doing? You've been distant for weeks now. Your parents, your mother. She's still controlling everything, and I don't know where I stand anymore." Peter's eyes softened, but there was still something guarded in the way he looked at her. "I know," he whispered. "I've been trying to figure it out. Trying to figure out how to fix this. Fix us." Sarah folded her arms across her chest, the cold sting of betrayal still fresh in her veins. "I can't keep waiting for you, Peter. I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not. You're choosing them over me, and I don't know how much longer I can stand it." Peter's face tightened, a flicker of hurt crossing his features before he quickly masked it. "I'm not choosing them over you. I've always been afraid of losing them. I've always been afraid of being alone." Sarah swallowed the lump in her throat. "But you're not alone. You have me. You have Liam." Her voice shook. "Why can't you see that?" Peter stood up suddenly, pacing back and forth, his hands running through his hair in frustration. "It's not that simple, Sarah. You don't get it. My parents have been a part of my life for so long. I feel like if I go against them, I'll lose everything. I'll lose myself. I can't just cut them out." "Then what about us?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "What about me and Liam? What do we mean to you? Because right now, I feel like we don't mean anything at all." Peter stopped pacing, his shoulders sagging in defeat. His hands clenched at his sides as though he were trying to keep it together, but the cracks were starting to show. "I don't know what to do," Peter admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I've tried to make everyone happy, but all I've done is make myself miserable. I'm stuck, Sarah. I'm stuck between what I want and what I'm supposed to do." Sarah stood, her heart aching for the man she had once known so well. She wanted to reach out, to comfort him, but the distance between them felt insurmountable. She was starting to realize that the man standing before her was no longer the person she had married. "You have a choice, Peter," she said, her voice steady, though the weight of her words hit her harder than she could have imagined. "You can choose them or you can choose us. But I'm not waiting anymore. If you can't make that decision, then I'll make it for you." Peter's eyes widened, and for a moment, Sarah thought she saw a flicker of recognition, as if the realization was dawning on him. Finally, what had been happening and how much he was losing. But the moment passed quickly. He shook his head, as if trying to reject her words. "I can't lose my family, Sarah," Peter said, his voice filled with pain. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to fix what's broken." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's heart was pounding in her chest, and the tears that she had held back for so long finally broke free, coursing down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly, but the damage had already been done. The words had been said, and there was no going back. "I wish you could see what you're losing," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Peter opened his mouth to speak, but before he could say anything, the sound of the front door opening reached them both. The unmistakable voice of Carol, sharp and commanding, cut through the stillness. "I thought you were still in bed, Peter." she called from the entryway. "What's going on in here? We need to—" But she stopped mid-sentence when she saw Sarah standing in the middle of the living room, tears in her eyes. "What's this about?" Carol asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Why does Sarah look like she's about to leave?" Sarah didn't look at her. She couldn't. Her entire body felt like it was on fire, every nerve screaming. She knew what was coming, knew that this moment had been inevitable. Peter's eyes flicked nervously from Sarah to his mother, the silent plea in his gaze unmistakable. "I think it's time for me to go," Sarah said quietly, her voice trembling. And with that, she turned and walked out of the room, her heart shattering as she stepped toward the door. Chapter 5: The Consequences. The door slammed behind her with a finality that felt like an echo of her entire world crumbling. Sarah didn't look back as she stepped out into the cool night air, her chest tight and her thoughts scattered. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know if she was supposed to be looking for something or running away from everything she'd built. The only thing that mattered right now was the storm brewing in her heart and the desperate need to breathe, to escape. She walked aimlessly down the street, past the dimly lit houses, the cars parked at the curb, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood settling into the night. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but her mind was racing. She had told Peter the truth she had tried to hide from herself for so long, the truth about what she was willing to lose if he didn't make a decision, the truth about the man he had become. But even as the words left her lips, she couldn't escape the crushing weight of what they meant. She had just given him an ultimatum, torn apart everything they had, and for what? To be free of the suffocating pressure that had followed her every step of the way since the moment Peter's family entered their lives? The guilt gnawed at her. She had always been the one to try to keep things together, to keep the peace. She had told herself time and time again that Peter would come around, that they could make it work. But now, as she walked through the quiet night, she couldn't ignore the truth any longer. He wasn't coming back. Not like this. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She stopped and pulled it out, her heart sinking when she saw Peter's name flash on the screen. The last thing she wanted to do was answer him. What was there left to say? She already knew how the conversation would go. He would apologize. He would say he didn't want her to leave. He would say all the things he knew she wanted to hear, but in the end it would all come down to the same thing. His loyalty to his parents, his fear of losing the family he had known for so long. He wasn't ready to stand by her, and that truth was something she had to accept, no matter how much it tore at her. But when the phone rang again, her finger hovered over the screen. This time, though, it wasn't Peter. It was Carol. A wave of anger surged through her. She couldn't even begin to fathom how or why Carol had her number saved. But she knew this wasn't going to be a conversation she wanted to have. If Peter had failed her, Carol had gone above and beyond. She had made her life a living hell without ever having to do a single thing for herself. She had always been in control, always twisting everything to her advantage. And now, her son's marriage was teetering on the edge of collapse. All because of her. Sarah swiped the screen to answer. "Hello," she said, her voice barely concealing the bitterness that had been bubbling beneath the surface for months. "Sarah," Carol's voice came through, sweet but insistent. "Where are you? Peter's been calling you. You need to come back." "Don't pretend to care," Sarah said, her words sharp and biting. "You don't want me back. You just want to make sure Peter doesn't get any ideas that he can choose his own family." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. Sarah could practically hear Carol's smile forming, even though she wasn't there to see it. "You're being dramatic," Carol finally said, the calmness in her voice infuriating Sarah even more. "We're just trying to help him, Sarah. You know, sometimes you need family to guide you." "Guide him?" Sarah echoed, her voice trembling with frustration. "No, what you're doing is controlling him. You've been doing it for years. And now, you've made it so that every time Peter and I try to have a life together, it's about you and Greg. You don't care about Peter's happiness, Carol. You just care about making sure you're in charge." There was another long pause. Then Carol's voice came, colder now, as if the sweetness was gone. "You're just upset because you've lost your grip on him. And now you're trying to pull him away from us. From his family. I'm not trying to pull him away, Sarah said, her throat tight. I'm just trying to save my marriage. But if you think I'm going to stay and watch you destroy everything that's important to me, you're wrong. I can't keep doing this. Not anymore. Carol's laugh echoed through the phone, and Sarah felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. You think you can just leave, Sarah? You think you can take my son away from me and expect things to go back to normal? It doesn't work that way. Peter will come to his senses. You'll see. Sarah's breath hitched. The confidence in Carol's words made her skin crawl. The idea that Peter might choose her parents over his own family, over Sarah and their son, was a reality she was no longer willing to ignore. Before she could say anything else, Carol hung up. For a long moment, Sarah stood there in the street, the weight of the conversation sinking in. The bitterness, the sense of betrayal was sharp. But beneath that, there was a strange emptiness that threatened to swallow her whole. How had it come to this? How had she allowed herself to become the villain in her own story? The last thing she wanted was for Peter to think she was the one breaking everything apart. But Carol had made it clear. It was never about Peter's happiness. It was about control. And as long as Peter continued to be their puppet, he would never truly be free. Just then, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Peter. She hesitated before answering. Sarah. Peter's voice cracked through the line, the vulnerability in it cutting through her defenses. I'm sorry. I've been thinking about what you said. And you're right. I've been torn for so long, and I didn't even realize how much I was letting everyone control me. But I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make things right. Sarah's breath hitched. She had waited for him to say something like this for so long. But now that the words were here, she wasn't sure if they meant anything anymore. You have to choose, Peter, Sarah said, her voice low but firm. But you can't just say the words and think they'll fix everything. I need to see action. I need to know that you're willing to fight for us. For this family. Peter didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of their unspoken truths. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, more unsure than before. I don't know if I can, Sarah. The words hit her like a slap in the face. Then maybe you've already made your choice, she said softly, the finality in her voice leaving no room for argument. Chapter 6. The Aftershock. The days after that conversation felt like a blur of raw emotions and unanswered questions. Sarah's mind was a constant whirlwind of thoughts, looping back to Peter's words, I don't know if I can. Every time she closed her eyes, that phrase echoed in her mind, gnawing at her like a wound that refused to heal. She had asked him to choose, and in his silence, she already had her answer. But the hardest part was that she couldn't bring herself to truly leave. The weight of the decision was too heavy, too final. For all her anger and frustration, there was still a part of her that hoped Peter would find his way back to her, back to their family. She clung to that hope, even though it felt more fragile with each passing day. Liam had become more unsettled over the past week. He cried more than usual, tossing and turning at night, as if he could sense the tension in the air. Sarah tried her best to comfort him, but every time she rocked him in her arms, a part of her felt like she was trying to hold together pieces of a broken puzzle. Nothing fit anymore. Nothing felt whole. It was a Thursday afternoon when Peter finally came home. Sarah had been sitting at the kitchen table trying to focus on a list of tasks, but her thoughts were elsewhere, always elsewhere. She heard the front door creak open, and her heart skipped a beat, the familiar sound of his footsteps making her stomach twist. He was home, but for how long? She didn't stand up immediately. She couldn't. She wasn't sure what version of Peter would walk into the room. Sarah? His voice was tentative, like he wasn't sure if he had the right to even be here. Can we talk? She took a deep breath, pushing herself up from the table. We can talk, but only if you're ready to say something real, Peter. I'm tired of waiting for things to change, and I'm tired of pretending everything's okay. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers as though he were trying to find the woman he had once known, the woman who had stood beside him through every hardship. But Sarah couldn't find the man she had married in him anymore. His shoulders were slumped, his face pale, and there was a sadness in his eyes that made her wonder if he had already given up on himself. "I've been thinking a lot," Peter said quietly, his voice breaking the silence that had settled between them. "About everything. About us. About my family. And I'm starting to see just how much I've allowed them to control me." "You're right, Sarah. I've been a coward." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to believe him. She did. But the pain of everything that had happened felt like a brick wall standing between them. How could she just let go of everything he had done? Of everything he hadn't done? "I don't want to be controlled anymore," Peter continued, his voice growing stronger now. "I don't want to keep living in a way that makes me miserable just to please them. I want to be with you, Sarah. I want our family to be whole. I just don't know if I'm strong enough to make that happen." Sarah felt the weight of his words in her chest. But still, a part of her hesitated. She had heard him say similar things before, but nothing ever seemed to change. Words were just words, and they never seemed to make it past the walls of his parents' house. "I've been waiting for you to choose, Peter," Sarah said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. "But now it feels like it's too late. I don't know if I can keep waiting for you to find your strength. I can't do this alone anymore." Peter's face twisted in anguish. "I'm not asking you to do it alone," he said quickly, stepping closer to her. I just need time. Time to figure out how to fix all of this. I'm not perfect, Sarah. I know I've messed up, but I swear, I don't want to lose you." Her heart cracked as she looked at him. She saw the pain in his eyes, the genuine regret, but she also saw the same indecision, the same uncertainty that had been there all along. How many times had they stood at this crossroads before, only for him to choose the comfort of what was familiar over the courage to fight for their love? "You've had time, Peter," she said softly, "and every time I've asked you to choose, you've chosen them. Every time. I don't know if I can keep doing this." A silence fell between them, heavier than it had ever been before. Sarah could feel the walls closing in, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them both. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could change, that they could rebuild everything they had lost. But something inside her knew the truth. She had been waiting for him to catch up with her for so long, but she was the one who had already moved on. "Sarah, please," Peter said, his voice desperate now. "I need you. I need our family. Don't leave me." Her chest tightened. "I don't want to leave you, Peter. But I can't keep sacrificing my own happiness just to hold onto something that's already gone." Peter reached for her hand, his fingers trembling. "Please just give me a chance. Let me prove to you that I can be the man you need me to be." For a moment, Sarah stood there, torn between the man she had once loved and the man who stood before her now. The man who was still so unsure of himself, still so lost in the shadow of his parents' expectations. She wanted to believe in him, wanted to believe that things could be different. But the truth was she was tired. Tired of trying to hold everything together. Tired of feeling like she was the only one fighting. "I've waited long enough, Peter," Sarah whispered, pulling her hand away from his. "I need to start living for myself. And I can't do that if I'm always waiting for you to choose me." Peter's face crumpled with emotion. But Sarah didn't look back. She couldn't. Not anymore. As she walked toward the door, she heard him call out behind her, his voice cracking. "Please don't go, Sarah. Please." But the door clicked shut with the finality of everything they had lost. And in that silence, Sarah knew that the life they had once dreamed of was already slipping through her fingers. Chapter 7, The Breaking Point. The days that followed were like walking through a fog. Sarah had retreated into herself, cocooned in a bubble of solitude that shielded her from the painful reality of her decision. She'd never imagined it would come to this, that the man she loved would stand before her, begging her to stay, and yet, she'd still walked away. It felt like a betrayal, like she had betrayed herself, betrayed their son. But in the quiet hours of the night, with Liam asleep in his crib, Sarah couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in her gut. She had made the right choice, hadn't she? She wasn't going to be the only one fighting for their marriage anymore. She couldn't keep sacrificing herself for a man who wasn't sure where his loyalties lay. She couldn't keep wondering if the next time they had a disagreement, Peter would choose his family over hers. Still, the silence in their home was deafening. She could still smell him in the living room, could feel the weight of his absence like a ghost lingering in every corner. And with each passing hour, the loneliness began to seep into her bones. Her phone buzzed, breaking her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, and her heart sank when she saw Peter's name. For the past few days, she hadn't answered his calls. She hadn't been ready to face him, to hear the apology she didn't believe anymore. But now, the desire to know what he had to say burned inside her. A mixture of frustration and longing she couldn't suppress. Taking a shaky breath, she swiped to answer. "Sarah," Peter's voice came through, sounding raw, almost broken. "Please, just hear me out." She closed her eyes, pressing the phone to her ear. Part of her wanted to hang up, to shut him out for good. But another part, the part she tried so desperately to suppress, still loved him, still wanted to believe that he could be the man he once promised her he would be. "I'm listening," she said, her voice flat, drained. "I'm not asking you to come back," Peter said quickly, his words tumbling out in a rush. "I know I've hurt you. I know I've let you down. But I can't lose you. I can't lose Liam. You're my family, Sarah. You have to know that." Sarah bit her lip, staring out the window at the streetlights flickering in the distance. The city felt so far away, like it was a world she could no longer touch. "You've already lost us, Peter," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. "You don't get to just decide you want us when it's convenient for you. You've been choosing your family over ours for so long that I don't even know who you are anymore." "I'm sorry, Sarah. I am. But please, give me one more chance," Peter pleaded. "I don't know how to make it right, but I will. I'll do whatever it takes." The desperation in his voice broke something inside her, but it wasn't enough to fix what had been broken between them. She wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that he could change, but the scars were too deep now. She had given him chances. She had spent so many sleepless nights hoping he would finally choose her. But the truth was, Sarah didn't know if she had it in her anymore to fight for something that had never felt like a partnership. "Peter," she said softly, her words weighed down by years of frustration. "You're still choosing them. Even now, you're still trying to fix things on their terms, not ours. You can't keep doing this. It's not just about us anymore. It's about who we've become in all of this. And I don't think I can live with that anymore." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Peter's breathing was the only sound that filled the space between them, heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. And then, finally, he spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. "I love you, Sarah, and I'm sorry. I don't know if I can ever make it right, but I will spend the rest of my life trying." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had cried enough. She had given enough of herself away. The realization settled in her chest, like a stone sinking deeper and deeper into the water. She couldn't keep living in a shadow of what could have been. She couldn't keep waiting for something that might never come. "I don't know what to say," Sarah replied, her voice tight. "I need time, Peter. I need time to figure out who I am without you." There was another pause, and Sarah could almost hear Peter's heart breaking through the phone. She could feel it in her own chest, the crushing ache of everything they had lost. "I understand," Peter finally said, his voice heavy with resignation. "But don't think for a second that I'm giving up on you. On us. I'll be here when you're ready." Sarah's breath hitched as she held the phone to her ear, listening to the faint sounds of his breathing, of him still holding on when she had already let go. The temptation to tell him she'd made a mistake, to run back into his arms, was almost overwhelming. But deep down, she knew she couldn't. She couldn't keep repeating the same cycle, the same heartbreak. "Goodbye, Peter," she said, her voice steady despite the tears she could feel threatening to spill. And before she could second-guess herself, she hung up. The room was still. The silence felt heavier now than ever before. Sarah sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. The pain, the emptiness, everything was overwhelming. But just as she felt the weight of everything crush her, a knock at the door shattered the stillness. She froze. Who could it be? Her heart pounded in her chest as she slowly stood, wiping her tears away. She walked toward the door, her legs feeling heavy with uncertainty. When she opened it, she wasn't prepared for what she saw. Greg, Peter's father. His face was tight with anger, but there was something else in his eyes. Something darker. "I need to talk to you, Sarah," he said coldly. Sarah's stomach twisted. What could he possibly want now? Chapter 8. The Confrontation. Greg's presence in the doorway was like a storm cloud that had rolled in without warning. Sarah instinctively took a step back, her pulse quickening. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to deal with Peter's father, not after everything that had happened between her and Peter. But she couldn't slam the door in his face either. Not yet. "What do you want, Greg?" Her voice was steady, but the anger bubbling just beneath the surface was hard to suppress. She had endured enough of his interference in her life, in her marriage. He'd been the one to support Peter's silence, the one who had encouraged his son to keep things from her, to ignore her needs. Now he was standing on her doorstep, as if nothing had changed. "I need to talk to you," Greg said, his voice low but firm. "I know what's been going on with you and Peter." The weight of his words hit her like a slap to the face. She hadn't expected him to come so directly at her. She hadn't expected him to acknowledge the situation so bluntly. But there it was. He knew. And in that moment, Sarah couldn't hide behind the walls she'd carefully constructed. The facade of strength crumbled, leaving her exposed. "You've made a mess of everything, haven't you?" Greg continued, stepping forward into the entryway without waiting for an invitation. He brushed past her, his presence filling the small space. "You've driven Peter away, Sarah. You think you're the only one who's suffering. Think again. My son is broken because of you." Sarah felt her chest tighten. This was the last thing she needed right now. The last thing she had expected was for Greg to show up at her door and start pointing fingers. She was so tired of being blamed for things that weren't entirely her fault. Peter had his part to play in all of this too, but Greg seemed to be completely blind to that fact. "You have no idea what's been going on, Greg," she snapped, stepping back to shut the door behind him. "You don't know how much I've tried to keep everything together. I'm not the one who chose his family over ours every single time. I'm not the one who allowed his mother and you to control every single decision we made. But somehow I'm the bad guy in this." Greg's eyes flashed with anger. "You don't get to play the victim, Sarah. You don't get to act like you've done no wrong here. I've been watching you manipulate Peter. You've made him feel like he has to choose between us and you, like he's the one in the wrong. But that's not true. He's your husband, and you're supposed to stand by him, not tear him down." Sarah felt a rush of heat rise in her chest. His words were like acid, burning every part of her that had tried to hold onto any kind of hope, any semblance of peace. She had never been one to back down from a fight, but Greg's accusations, his arrogance, was pushing her to the brink. "Manipulate him?" she repeated, her voice rising with every word. "Are you seriously telling me I've manipulated him? After everything you've done to him? After everything you've forced him to carry? I've tried to be supportive. I've tried to make this marriage work. But you, have never once let us have a chance. I'm not the one who kept him from standing up for himself. You've made him feel like he owes you everything, like he has to put your needs before his own, before his family." Greg's face twisted with disgust. "You don't understand what it means to be loyal, Sarah. Family comes first. You think you can just walk away from all of this, that you can just pull him out of this family like he's some kind of toy that you can break when it's convenient for you? It doesn't work that way." Tears stung Sarah's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not in front of him, not when he was standing there, acting as if she were the cause of all their problems. She had been patient, had tried for years to make it work. She had bent over backward to accommodate their needs, their expectations, their suffocating love. But it was never enough, and she was done trying. "I am walking away, Greg," she said, her voice hard now. "I've tried to make this work. I've tried to make Peter understand that he needs to put us first. But every time it's been you and your wife and your damn expectations. And now you're standing here telling me I'm the one who's broken this family? No, I'm done being the one who has to keep fixing everything for you. Greg's jaw clenched, his face turning red with fury. But Sarah didn't flinch. She couldn't. Not anymore. Not after everything. I don't want you to fix anything for me. Sarah, Greg growled, taking a step closer, his voice lowering to a dangerous pitch. But you better believe I'm not going to let you tear my son apart. If you think you can just walk away and take him with you, you're mistaken. I won't let that happen. For a moment, Sarah thought she might snap. The words he was saying, the way he was looking at her, it was as if he expected her to cower, to apologize, to beg for his approval. But Sarah wasn't that woman anymore. She wasn't the woman who would let someone else control her life. And she wasn't about to let Greg dictate her future, or Peter's, for that matter. You don't have control over me anymore, Greg, Sarah said, her voice unwavering. And you never will again. The silence that followed was suffocating, thick with the tension between them. Greg's breathing was shallow, his hands balled into fists at his sides. For a moment, Sarah thought he might lunge at her, but instead, he just stood there, glaring at her, as if he couldn't believe what had just happened. I'm not going to let this go, he said through gritted teeth. I'm not going to let you destroy my son's life. I'm not destroying anyone's life, Greg. I'm just trying to live mine. Sarah shot back, her voice cold, final. And with that, she turned and walked away, leaving Greg standing there in the hallway, seething with rage. As she closed the door behind her, the weight of the conversation lingered. She had expected some resistance, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. The realization hit her hard. There was no easy way out of this. Greg wouldn't stop. Peter wouldn't stop. And now neither would she. Chapter 9, The Price of Peace. The sound of the door clicking shut echoed in Sarah's mind long after Greg had left. His words hung in the air, clinging to her like an invisible weight that she couldn't shake. I won't let you destroy my son's life. The accusation stung, not because she thought he was right, but because she knew it was just one more thing to add to the pile of guilt that had been building for years. Sarah paced the living room, trying to shake off the suffocating tension that had settled over her. Her hands were clammy, her heart still pounding from the confrontation. She hadn't expected Greg to come in like a force of nature, demanding her to bow to his will, yet there he was. The man who had silently orchestrated so many of Peter's decisions, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, was now accusing her of trying to break their family apart. It was infuriating and, in some twisted way, it made her feel small. But she couldn't let herself stay in that place. She couldn't. Liam's soft gurgle from the nursery broke through her thoughts. She walked to the door of his room, her steps slow, her mind racing. Her son. Her little boy. The one thing she knew she had to protect. The one thing she had always tried to shield from all the mess that surrounded her. She pushed the door open and smiled weakly as Liam reached for her, his tiny hands flailing, a grin spreading across his chubby face. Her heart melted. He was the reason she had fought so hard for so long. He was the reason she had tried to make things work. But she was beginning to understand that no matter how much love she poured into her son, there were things she couldn't change, things that were beyond her control. As she picked him up, his head resting on her shoulder, she realized something she hadn't let herself admit before. Peter was not the same man she had fallen in love with, and neither was she. Peter sat in his car outside the house, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his mind a jumbled mess of regret and frustration. He had left Sarah's house hours ago, his heart heavier with each passing minute. He had begged her to come back, begged her to give him another chance, but nothing had worked. Nothing had been enough. He hated the silence between them, the distance that had grown between them over the last few years. He hated that he had let his family take control of their relationship. But more than that, he hated how powerless he felt to fix everything now. He had tried to be the good son, the good husband, but it seemed that no matter what he did, he always failed. His mind kept replaying Greg's words from earlier, the cold accusation that Sarah was the one who had driven him away. And deep down, Peter couldn't help but wonder if his father was right. Had he been too focused on everyone else's needs, his family's, his mother's, To even consider what Sarah needed? Had he made her feel like she was the one who didn't matter? He closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the steering wheel. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. He had never imagined that he would lose Sarah, that his marriage would fall apart like this. And yet, here he was, alone in his car, thinking about how far away he was from everything that used to matter. The sound of his phone buzzing interrupted his thoughts, and he glanced at the screen, hoping it was Sarah calling. But instead, it was a message from his mother. His stomach tightened as he opened it, already dreading the words. "Peter, I need to talk to you. It's important. Please come by." The urgency in his mother's text sent a chill down his spine. He had avoided her calls for days, knowing that the last thing he needed was another lecture from her. But he knew better than to ignore her when she was insistent. With a sigh, he started the engine and drove toward his parents' house. Inside the house, Sarah was still holding Liam, trying to calm herself down after the confrontation with Greg. She had expected Peter to come back and beg her to reconsider, but the longer she waited, the more she realized he wasn't coming. The weight of the situation was unbearable, and she was starting to wonder if she had made the right choice. Could she have tried harder? Could she have been more patient? The doubt gnawed at her, and she pushed it aside, focusing on Liam's sleepy face. She had to do what was best for him, and right now that meant standing her ground even if it hurt. But just as she turned to put Liam back in his crib, there was a knock at the door. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it Peter? She didn't know if she was ready to face him. Not after everything. But she had to know. She had to find out if there was any hope left for them. She slowly walked to the door, her breath shallow with anticipation. When she opened it, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Peter. It was Greg again. Her stomach turned as she tried to mask her surprise. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. Greg didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need you to listen to me, Sarah," he said, stepping into the house without waiting for an invitation. "I know you think I'm the enemy here, but you need to understand something. You're not just hurting Peter by walking away. You're hurting Liam, too." Sarah froze, her grip tightening on the doorknob. "What do you mean?" Greg's eyes darkened as he met her gaze. "I know what it feels like to be abandoned, to feel like you've lost everything. And I'm telling you, if you do this, if you tear this family apart, you'll regret it for the rest of your life." Sarah felt a pang of fear stab at her chest. The words were like daggers, cutting through her resolve. She had never felt more cornered, more alone. But just as she opened her mouth to respond, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. The door behind her creaked open, and she turned in shock. It was Peter. His eyes were wide with disbelief, his face pale. "Dad, what the hell are you doing here?" Peter's voice was sharp, his anger bubbling to the surface. Greg turned toward his son, but there was no apology in his eyes, only defiance. "Peter, you need to understand," Greg said, his tone almost pleading. "I'm doing this for you, for your future, for Liam." Peter's gaze shifted to Sarah, his expression unreadable. And in that moment, Sarah realized something terrifying. No matter how hard she fought, no matter how much she wanted to believe things could go back to normal, they never would. Because the very people she loved, the ones she had sacrificed for, were the ones tearing everything apart. Chapter 10, The Breaking Point. Peter stood frozen at the threshold, his gaze flickering between his father and Sarah. His body was tense, as if every muscle had locked into place, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene before him. Greg had never come to Sarah's door like this before, without a hint of diplomacy or restraint. And Sarah, his wife, the woman he loved, the woman he was trying to save, stood on the opposite side of the room, her face pale, her eyes a mixture of confusion and fear. What was happening? How had everything fallen apart so quickly? "Dad, what are you doing here?" Peter finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His emotions swirled like a hurricane inside him. Anger, betrayal, guilt. But the overwhelming feeling was one of disbelief. How had they reached this point? How had it come to this? Greg didn't flinch. He stood his ground, meeting Peter's gaze with a hard stare. "I'm doing what you won't do, Peter," he said, his voice low and firm. "I'm protecting you from making the biggest mistake of your life. From walking away from your family." Peter felt the heat of anger rise in his chest. "What do you mean, protecting me, Dad? You're not protecting me. You're suffocating me. You've always suffocated me." His words came out sharper than he intended, but there was no stopping them now. "You've been pulling my strings, controlling every decision I've made for years. And you," he glanced at Sarah, his throat tightening, "you think this is all her fault?" The tension in the room escalated, the air thick with accusation and frustration. Greg took a step toward Peter, his face reddening. "Don't you dare. You think I haven't seen what's been happening? Peter, you think I haven't been watching? She's been driving you away from us, from your family. You don't even see it, do you? She's making you choose between her and me, between her and your mother." "Enough!" Sarah's voice rang out like a slap, startling both men. Her hands were shaking, but she stood tall, her eyes burning with something fiercer than Peter had ever seen before. "Don't you dare talk about me like that. Don't you dare accuse me of tearing this family apart when you're the one who's been destroying it from the inside." Greg opened his mouth to retort, but Sarah cut him off. "You think you're helping, Greg? You think your son needs to hear this from you? He's not a child anymore. He's a grown man, and if you think forcing him to choose between us, between you and me, is going to fix anything, you're wrong." She stepped toward Greg, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've never once given him the space to make his own decisions, and now you're doing this. You're making everything worse." Peter's heart raced, torn between the anger he felt for both of them. His father had always treated him like a project, a possession to be molded, shaped, and manipulated into the image Greg wanted. But Sarah had always wanted to understand him, wanted to build something with him. And yet, here they were, tangled in a web of misunderstandings, guilt, and silence. "You think I've been manipulating you?" Sarah's voice wavered but remained strong. She turned to Peter, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been trying, Peter. I've been trying so hard to keep us together. But you've been pulled in so many directions, between your family, your work, your guilt, and I've been left behind. You've never once asked me what I need, what we need." Peter felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. He was trapped in a whirlwind of emotions, his heart aching for Sarah, for the things they had lost, for the things they might never get back. But there was also a small part of him that still believed in the possibility of fixing this, of rebuilding, of finding a way to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. But with every word Greg spoke, that hope grew dimmer. "Peter, I'm doing this for your own good," Greg said again, his voice rising, his eyes narrowing. "You have a responsibility to your family. You owe it to your mother, to me, to your son. You can't just throw everything away for the sake of a marriage that's clearly falling apart." Peter's eyes hardened. "You don't get it, Dad. You've never gotten it. It's not about loyalty to you or to Mom. It's about me. It's about what's best for us. I'm not a puppet to be controlled. I'm not your second chance at having a perfect life. I have a family now, too." His voice cracked slightly, and he looked over at Sarah, who was standing by the door, her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. Greg's face reddened with frustration. "So this is how it ends, then? You're going to choose her over your family?" Peter's heart skipped. "I'm choosing myself for once. And if you can't respect that, then maybe you need to take a long look at the way you've been treating me." The words hung in the air, thick with finality. And just like that, Peter realized something deep in his gut. He couldn't keep living his life for other people. He couldn't keep being someone he wasn't. Not for his father, not for his mother, and not for Sarah either. His heart ached as he looked at her, seeing the pain in her eyes. It wasn't just the family that had been torn apart. It was him too. "I'm done, Dad," Peter said, his voice hoarse but resolute. "I can't keep living in this world you've built for me." Greg's face twisted, his hands clenched into fists. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life. I warned you." Peter's chest tightened. his breath coming out in shallow bursts. "No, Dad. The biggest mistake was never letting me make my own decisions. The biggest mistake was never letting me live my own life." And with that, Peter turned toward Sarah, his gaze meeting hers. Her face softened, and for a brief moment, they shared a look that said more than words ever could. The air between them was still thick with unresolved tension, but there was something else there. Something raw, something honest. "I need you, Sarah," Peter whispered, his voice breaking. "I need to try again. I need to fix this." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, and she stepped forward, closing the distance between them. She didn't speak at first, her heart racing as she reached for his hand. She didn't know if it was too late, if they could still rebuild what had been broken. But she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't walk away from him. Not now. Not after everything. "I need you too, Peter," she said softly. "But we have to be honest with each other. We have to fight for us. Together." And just as they embraced, the door behind them creaked open, and they both turned to see Greg standing there, his face twisted with fury. "Don't think this is over," Greg spat. "You will regret this." But Peter didn't care. He had made his choice, and for the first time in a long time, he finally felt like he was making the right one.